people that walked in darkness have seen a great light. On those who lived in a land as dark as death, a light has dawned. For a child has been born to us, a son is given to us. He will bear the symbol of dominion on his shoulder, and his title will be Wonderful Counselor, Mighty Hero, Eternal Father, Prince of Peace. Wide will be the dominion, and boundless the peace bestowed on David's throne and on his kingdom, to establish and support it with justice and righteousness.
Thou visitest the earth, and blessest it, and blessest it, and crownest the year with thy goodness, and crownest the year with thy goodness. Thou visitest the earth, and blessest it, and blessest it, and crownest the year with thy goodness, and crownest the year with thy goodness. Thou crownest the year with thy goodness. Thou crownest the year with thy goodness. Thou visitest, and blessest it, and crownest the year with thy goodness. Thou crownest the year with thy goodness. Thou visitest the earth, thou visitest and blessest it, thou crownest the year with thy goodness. Thou crownest the year with thy goodness. Thou crownest the year with thy goodness. Thou crownest the year with thy goodness.
In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. All things were made by him, and without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. And the light shineth in darkness, and the darkness comprehended it not. There was a man sent from God, whose name was John. The same came for a witness, to bear witness of that light, that all men through him might believe. He was not that light, but was sent to bear witness of that light. That was the true light, which lighteth every man that cometh into the world. He was in the world, and the world was made by him, and the world knew him not. He came unto his own, and his own received him not. But as many as received him, to them gave he power to become the sons of God, even to them that believe on his name, which were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. And the Word was made flesh, and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory, the glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth.
Welcome to the chapel of Robinson College here at the University of Cambridge. It's 2020, it's lockdown, it's Christmas, and it's empty. This is clearly not the Christmas that many of us were expecting or wanting. But we're very pleased today to welcome our guest speaker, Shane Claiborne, who will speak in detail about the Word made flesh. That is, when the CEO of the multiverse became thoroughly and utterly and disgustingly human. Shane Claiborne is a Christian activist who has worked with Mother Teresa in Calcutta, as a human shield in Iraq and Afghanistan, and is a best-selling author. We begin our reflections usually with a reading from Scripture, and our final reading today focuses on the sheer disappointment felt by John the Baptist and the confusion to which that led, because Jesus was not the Messiah he expected, and maybe not the Messiah that he wanted. And so our final reading comes from the 7th chapter of St. Luke. Shane Claiborne, a very warm welcome to this version of Robinson College Chapel on this, our Christmas service.
Wow, this is such a delight. Thank you for having me, and on such a special holy time. Thank you.
It's great to have you here. Thank you. I recall hearing you around 10 years or so ago in London, offering a very brief, brilliant interpretation of a passage from the New Testament that highlighted how completely out of the norm for biblical interpreters, you had engaged all kinds of dimensions of your humanity into the interpretation of a text and came up with something that, although it was completely defensible biblically, had not been, and I know this now because I've studied it, has not been written anywhere in any commentary on Luke's gospel until the one that I'm writing, of course. You mentioned that John the Baptist was having doubts about who Jesus was. And so he sent messengers to Jesus, and Jesus' response, John says, "Are you the one to come, or should we expect another?" And the main thing that you pointed out is that Jesus didn't just say, "Yes, I'm the one to come."
Yeah.
Arriving at a pattern of biblical interpretation like that is not as simple, as straightforward as it might sound. And I wondered if you could talk about how you've come to interpret Scripture this way.
Yeah. So, well, I do, this text, it's in Luke 7, I think it was, that I was coming out of. And I mean, it's a curious thing, right? So they grew up together, they're cousins. John baptized Jesus. I mean, you'd think, he's got all this figured out. And yet when he's in jail, right before he's about to be beheaded, I think he really was having these doubts and questions, or even this uncertainty of how's this thing going down, you know? And so when he sends his disciples to ask Jesus, "Are you the one we've all been waiting for?" You know, um, that answer struck me, you know, as it's a pretty straightforward question, and it's interesting because there are times where Jesus answers these, you know, simple questions uh, directly, and then there's times that he provokes, you know, kind of questions the question, right? and
Right,
and so in
right.
this case, when he throws it back and says, "Go tell John what you've seen and heard," it's that invitation to sort of remember the evidence of that the trail of crumbs behind him. But what one of the things that I was really struck by that you know, I hear you kind of alluding to is that it's very characteristic of Jesus to not go around flaunting that he's the Son of God. In fact, half the time when people figure it out and they're like, "Whoa, you're the Messiah," he's like, "Shh, you know, don't go telling everybody." And it's as if he wants people to figure this out on their own and not just have it crammed down their throats. That kind of truth is discovered rather than forced on us. And I can't remember who it was that I first heard. Someone said that the gospel spreads best not by force, but by fascination. And that's what it seems like Jesus does so well, is that fascinates the world with God's love. And it's that so I, you know, as I think of the the scripture, I've really learned so much from my Jewish friends and others that love to wrestle with the text. And yeah, some, you know, it's been said that the text is sort of like a diamond. You know, you turn it and the light shines differently as you turn it. So I think it's less of a puzzle to be figured out and more of something that we marvel at and, you know, wrestle with together.
Well, the text is one of the dimensions of the text, I suppose, is brought to life at this time of year on Christmas cards and so on. It's our Christmas service, and I wonder if I can ask you the. It just occurred to me the three kings were from modern day Iraq, and you have been to Iraq. You were going in the other direction, I guess, than the three kings were going. I wonder if you might say a little bit about what drove you to do that and how that might affect the way that you interpret scripture.
Oh, I mean, it changed everything for me to travel through this holy land where so many unholy things continue to happen. You know, I mean, I've been in uh, Israel and Palestine, the West Bank, and all over, you know, from Jordan, but mostly when I was in Iraq. Um, I was there during the bombing and the war, and um, I'll tell you one memory that has shaped my imagination. It shaped who I am. Is right as the bombs began falling in March of 2003, after September 11th, of course, and there was a prayer service in Baghdad, and hundreds of Christians had gathered to pray, all different denominations. And as we began to pray for peace, they read a statement that the bishops and others had kind of collaboratively written, and it was to Muslim people. And it said, basically, "We love you. We want you to know that we love you. You're created in the image of God." It was this declaration, you know, that we're all made from the same dirt. And then they started singing Amazing Grace. Um, and in Arabic. They're singing in Arabic. And so I'm so moved. I've got tears rolling down my face. And I run up afterwards and I grabbed one of the bishops and I said, "This is one of the most powerful services I've ever experienced," you know. And then, you know, I'm talking a little bit and I said to him, I said, "I had no idea there's so many Christians in Iraq." And the bishop looks at me and he's very gentle, right? He goes, "Yes, this is where Christianity started." And then he points out the window and he goes, "That's the Tigris and the Euphrates. Have you heard of them?" You know, and he goes, "The Garden of Eden was right down the street." You know, he starts winking at me and he's like, and he says, and then he said this, Simon, he said, "You didn't invent Christianity in America. You only domesticated it." So go back and tell the church in America that we are praying for them to remember who they are. Isn't that, I mean, that
That's
it still
incredible.
sends chills down my arms, because I think, especially during this time of Christmas, ironically, it's very easy to forget what this whole story is about and where we come from, right?
And that's precisely what the ministries in the community where you live seem to be pursuing, isn't it? It's the Christmas being the time when the word becomes flesh.
Mm.
And I wonder if you can say a little then about how, being back in the US, how the word becomes flesh within the community where you are living.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of my neighbors who speaks Spanish as her first language put it very plainly for me, and she said, sometimes you'll appreciate this, all of you there at Cambridge. She said, sometimes we over intellectualize and academic, we make all this stuff too heady. And she said, like the Incarnation, scholars talk about it, people write books about it, but she says, in Spanish, when you order your burrito con carne, it means with meat. She said, the Incarnation is God with meat. This is when God puts skin on, fleshes out love, so that we know what love looks like with skin. So that's, I mean, you can't get much better theology than that. Some of my best theology, I feel like I've learned from the streets and from my neighborhood, even though I went to Princeton, and I've been to, all these, academic places. I think sometimes that's what we've got to remember, is that this
Yeah.
whole story is about a God who leaves the comfort of heaven and joins the struggle here on earth, right? And is not just born into any body, but is born into a brown skinned Palestinian Jewish refugee body. And from birth till his execution, he is leaning, embodying that suffering and exposing the violence of our world, the sin, and triumphing over it with love. So that's something to celebrate this Christmas. But it's easy to forget that story. So I think we've got to keep our feet on the ground. We've got to, as Jesus said, our theology has to come down to earth.
This is what the liberation theologians used to say. I think theology arises at sunset.
Mm.
And I think this is something that you speak about in your book, which has had its 10-year anniversary edition published recently, that you look for what God is doing in the world and do it with him almost. And that alertness, which is there presumably with the Magi, with the three kings, but that seems to be what's going on in your place. So one of the opening scenes from your book was the cathedral, the Catholic cathedral that was being closed down, and you guys recognized something important was happening there. I wonder if you might finish by saying something about how that experience exploded into something unexpected.
Surely. Well, I mean, so ironically, our vision for the church started in the ruins of this old abandoned Catholic church in Philly, right? Where we've got abandoned cathedrals, like, probably you have some of these too. And these families in Philadelphia who were homeless, these are mostly mothers and children, and there were over 3,000 families waiting for housing. And they saw all these abandoned buildings and had nowhere to go as winter was approaching. And so they found this beautiful Catholic sanctuary. I mean, it was mostly boarded up, and they moved into it, and they started living there while they were trying to find out more permanent solutions. And sadly, what happened was the Catholic Church gave them an eviction notice and said that they were trespassing, and if they weren't out within 48 hours, they could be arrested. And so Simon, that's we did what all good young people. I was 20 years old, in undergrad at the time, right outside of Philly, and we held a prayer meeting because that seemed like a good thing to do, and yet there are those times where you throw your hands up at God and you say, God, we need you to do something. And you sort of feel God say, I did do something. I made you. Get down there, And so we went down And the families had hung a banner on the front of the building that said, "How can we worship a homeless man on Sunday and ignore one on Monday?" So that's a powerful thing, even this Christmas, right? To remember there was no room in the inn, and these families were living in that same struggle, right? And they actually were, their faith was so robust. They ended up holding a press conference, and they said, "We mean no disrespect to the Catholic Church, but we have nowhere to go." And then they said, "And we've talked to the real owner of this building, the Lord." And God said we can stay until we figured something out. And they did. They stayed for weeks and weeks. And so that was the real catalyst that started our community. And then we started reading about the early church in the book of Acts. We started reading liberation theology. We Francis and Claire and Assisi, that started in the old abandoned cathedral at San Damiano, like all this. So that's been our story for the last 25 years. We just this year got to go back inside of that old abandoned church, which is still abandoned, and tell some stories to remember it.
Am I right in thinking, do I recall this? Did you get married there?
Yes, Katie and I got married there. A couple of my other friends got married. We got permission to go back in because we thought that this is not going to be good if we get arrested as we're getting married or something, So yeah.
That's a magnificent example of the Word becoming flesh, and I suppose it just hangs a bit of a question mark over our traditional notion of what really constitutes Christmas. I mean, if there is such a thing as a Christmas message, how would you put words on it? Or would you put words on it?
Absolutely. I mean, what pops into my head immediately is a story, of a pastor I know he said, we had decorated the whole sanctuary to get ready for the Christmas cantata, all the services. And he said, right before Christmas, he was praying on the altar, and he said the strangest thing happened. He said, "I felt like God wanted me to just strip the altar and the sanctuary of all the decorations, just get rid of them." And he's like, "I knew that there would be some angry elders, so I didn't take this lightly." He said, "I said, am I hearing you right?" And he said, and then it got weirder. He said, that night I stayed up all night. I took all the decorations down that we had put up, and this is right before the Christmas service. He said, and then I felt like God wanted me to go gather some manure from the farm and put it on the altar. So he redecorated the altar with manure, right? And he says the next morning everyone came in, and at first, they're really shaken by this, and they smell the poop, And he's like, and he said, but it's one of the most powerful services that we've ever had in our church. And he said, what everybody saw as they came in was this memory of what this whole story is about a God who leaves all the comfort of heaven to join the struggle here, who is born into the poop, right? Into the brokenness and crap and the funk of humanity, of our human condition, and shows us the light and love of who God is. And so I'm not suggesting that you do that at Cambridge or, but I think that it's so easy to forget, right? That as we, scurry to buy stuff for people who already have so much, and we forget those who are cold, those who are struggling to make it at all. And one other little story, my friend, they started this thing called the Advent Conspiracy, that's now a global movement to reclaim Christmas as a time for compassion, not consumption. So it's a beautiful vision, right? But it started when one of my friends, he was talking with his kids about Christmas and the real meaning of Christmas. And one of the kids themselves said, well, maybe this Christmas we shouldn't get more than 3 gifts, because that's all Jesus got, and and he was talking, right, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And he's like, and one of them was myrrh. Like, what kid wants myrrh? But so they rethought, all of the clutter of Christmas. So maybe it's a good time, during this season to remember the struggle, to remember those who are having a hard time making it all at all, and to reclaim Christmas as a time for compassion, not just consumption and consumerism.
That sounds like a great place to conclude. Shane Claiborne, thank you very much.
So good to be with you. Bless you all. Merry Christmas. And, let's keep in touch. Let's do this again sometime. Bless you.
Same to you. God bless.